No one in the studio knew that when the camera caught the soft glint of a silver cross beneath the host's collar, everything they thought this episode would be quietly began to dissolve. Laughter had come easy just minutes before. Studio lights shimmered off polished floors and practiced smiles. The Steve Harvey show was in motion, steady and confident. Stage hands moved like clockwork. Cameras found their frames. The band landed its final note. And then Steve walked out, easy in his rhythm, familiar to millions. The crowd responded with reflexive applause, expecting light stories, charming guests, and a dose of comedy. What they got instead was a glimpse into something far more fragile. And then he walked in, not to fanfare, not to music. He just walked. Dark jeans, clean brown boots, navy sport coat over a black tee. It wasn't a costume, but it said everything. The room responded before anyone spoke. Steve welcomed him with that half smile, the one the world knew. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve began, voice steady, "you know him. You've watched him rise, fall, and rise again. He's not just Hollywood royalty. He's resilience. He's presence. He's Robert Downey Jr." Applause. Expected, respectful. Downey smiled softly, nodded. His handshake with Steve was firm, but brief. No extra flair, no self-importance. Just two men sharing air and time. They eased into conversation. They joked about LA traffic, about knees that crack when you crouch too fast, about how car chases are safer when someone yells cut at the end. The audience laughed, tensionless, unaware of the shift coming. It started quiet. Downey leaned back slightly, mid-sentence, eyes catching something, a glint under Steve's collar. His gaze lingered. No wide eyes, no dramatic pause. Just a subtle stillness, like a thought interrupting itself. The camera, almost on instinct, moved tighter to his face. He wasn't looking at Steve anymore. He was looking at something behind his eyes. Steve noticed. His hand moved, almost reflexively, brushing the crucifix like he was steadying something fragile. "You wear that every day?" Downey asked, voice low, almost curious. Steve nodded. "Every single one." Another pause. "Longer now," Downey murmured. The moment didn't stretch awkwardly. It deepened. Steve said nothing. The cue cards beside him went untouched. No need. The script had stepped aside. Downey turned slightly toward the audience, then looked down for a beat. When he looked back up, his eyes were heavier, but focused. "Can I tell you something I've never said on TV before?" Steve didn't move, just nodded once, and the air changed. Not with tension, with stillness, reverence. An audience that came for entertainment found itself holding its breath. The band in the corner stilled. Even backstage movements faded. Downey sat with his hands folded in his lap. He wasn't here to act. No quips, no armor. Just a man carrying something delicate. His thumb traced the edge of his ring. Then gently he looked up again. "I almost didn't come today." Steve's head tilted slightly. No question, just listening. "Not because of traffic," Downey continued, "because sometimes it's just hard to show up." He took a breath. "There was a time I didn't want to wake up anymore." A hush so dense it seemed to press against the walls. Downey looked nowhere in particular. "After my dad passed, something in me went silent, not broken, just vanished." He paused, not to hold back tears, but to give space to the words. "I've never said that on a stage before." Steve didn't interrupt. The cameras were still, the world now far away from jokes and segments. "There's this thing people say," Downey said, "that time heals all wounds." He gave the softest smile, an echo of irony, not cynicism. "It doesn't. Some wounds stop bleeding on the outside, but inside they stay wide open. You just learn how to build around them." His gaze shifted again to the small silver cross. It caught the stage light like it had something to say. Downey wasn't blinking. "I used to think healing meant forgetting. It doesn't. It means remembering without sinking." Steve leaned in, his forearms resting on his knees. Not out of performance, out of instinct, out of respect. Downey looked at him, and then beyond him. "Sometimes the bravest thing we do is show up. Quietly, honestly. The audience as one remained frozen. No claps, no coughs, just a collective silence that said, "We're here." We heard that. Downey exhaled, and the crucifix, impossibly quiet, seemed to shine just a little brighter. "I thought I was ready for anything," Robert Downey Jr. said quietly. "I've been broke. I've been told no more times than I can count. I've been sliced open on operating tables, ridiculed in public, replaced, recycled, forgotten. But nothing prepares you to bury your own child. Silence. Not the awkward kind, the living kind, the kind that breathes and lingers and forces you to listen." He didn't look angry or dramatic, just honest. The kind of honesty that doesn't demand attention. It surrenders to it. "I stopped talking," he continued. "Stopped feeling. I moved, I spoke, but I wasn't really there. My wife tried, my daughter too, but I was behind a wall none of them could get through." Steve shifted slightly, the mic on his lap picking up the faintest sound of his breath catching. He looked down, just for a second, then back up at Downey as if recentering. And Downey, for the first time since walking on stage, looked not just at Steve, but through the lights, into the audience. Not to perform, but to share air with them. "I didn't come here to talk about a film," he said. "I came because something happened. Something changed." That simple declaration shifted the room again. Not louder, not brighter, just deeper. Downey didn't rush his next words. His gaze drifted, not avoiding, but searching for a version of himself he wasn't sure existed anymore. "I was in Miami," he said softly, "alone in a hotel room I didn't belong to. I'd been there for weeks, curtains drawn, lights off, no calls, no reason." He leaned forward slightly, the weight of the memory dragging at his spine. "It was past midnight. I couldn't sleep, couldn't scream, couldn't feel anything sharp enough to cut through the fog. No one in the studio dared move. Even silence somehow leaned in to protect him. My phone was face down beside me, not for checking. Just there. I picked it up. No purpose, no plan. Just because." He took a breath. "I opened a random app, clicked a video, no title, no thumbnail. Just your face, Steve." Steve sat up straighter, a flicker crossing his brow. He didn't speak. His hand brushed the crucifix again, almost unconsciously. "I didn't even know it was you at first," Downey said. "You were on a stage, maybe a church, maybe a school. I don't know. The lighting was bad. The mic was crackling. You weren't dressed for TV. You looked tired." Downey glanced at Steve, not as a host, as a man. "And then you said something." The room waited. "You said, if you're still breathing, it means God's not done with you." The sentence fell like a stone into a still lake. No splash, just slow, wide ripples. "I don't know why that hit me," Downey said, "but it did. I replayed it. Then again. Then again. Not because I was inspired, but because I could hear it. In you. You weren't preaching. You were surviving." Steve inhaled, slow and even, but his eyes, they were full now. "That line cracked something open in me," Downey whispered, "not because it was profound, but because it was real." He looked up, his voice firm but quiet. "The next morning I got out of bed, for the first time in weeks. Not because it felt better, not because I was healed, but because I remembered maybe I wasn't finished yet." He looked into the crowd now, not to perform, to include them. "You didn't know I was watching. You didn't know someone like me, on every screen, every billboard, was sitting alone trying not to exist." Steve didn't answer. He couldn't, and he didn't need to. "That's the thing," Downey said, almost a whisper now. "Sometimes the words you don't even remember saying become the rope someone else is clinging to." No sound. Even the lights seemed to dim slightly, not because someone adjusted them, but because the moment demanded it. There was no show anymore. Just two men, one memory, one heartbeat stretched across 1,000. Downey shifted in his seat, carefully reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. His fingers moved slow, intentional. He pulled out a piece of paper, folded, frayed, worn thin at the creases. This, he said, holding it gently between his hands, has been with me for years. Flights, film sets, trailers. I didn't even realize how often I touched it until my daughter found it in the laundry once. Steve blinked, puzzled for a beat. She thought it was a script, Downey smiled faintly. But I couldn't explain it. I just needed it. He opened the paper slowly, reverently, like it was scripture. And when he looked up, his voice didn't break. It didn't rise. It just softened. No longer Downey the star, just Robert the man. You said, he murmured, if you're still breathing, it means God's not done with you. Then he unfolded the paper. Slowly, deliberately. You're not too far gone, not too broken, not too messed up. God doesn't need you to be strong. He needs you to be willing. Sometimes your survival is the sermon. Sometimes your weakness is the way. And sometimes, just sometimes, your breath is the only prayer you'll say all day. Each sentence felt like it echoed, not just in the room but inside people. Gentle but impossible to ignore. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers tracing slow circles over the crucifix on his chest. He wasn't performing. Something deep had moved inside him. I don't remember ever saying all that, he whispered. You didn't need to, Downey replied. But I did. I needed to hear it. He paused, letting the weight settle between them. And it didn't fix me, didn't bring my son back, but it gave me one thing I hadn't felt in a long time. A breath. Permission, he said, to still be here, to feel, to breathe. He carefully folded the paper again along its worn creases, not stuffed into a pocket, not hidden. He placed it gently on the table between them, like someone laying down a weapon or lighting a candle. It just sat there, fragile, but somehow unbreakable. Steve stared at it like it had become something more than paper, something alive. You kept all that? He asked, voice low. I had to, Downey said, because when the world got loud again, red carpets, noise, demands, that little piece of paper reminded me who I was when no one was watching. The studio audience remained utterly still. Some leaned in, others wiped at their eyes, but not one person shifted in their seat. Downey looked at Steve, direct, steady. Your voice reached me when nothing else could, he said, and I wrote it down because I never wanted to forget what it felt like to be seen. And just like that, the distance between fame and faith collapsed into something deeply, painfully human. Downey's fingers hovered over the folded note, its worn lines glinting under the studio lights like veins in something barely held together. Steve didn't touch it. He just watched, as if touching it might make it disappear. But Downey wasn't done. He reached into his jacket again, this time slower, not for effect, for reverence, as if what he was about to reveal wasn't just another item, it was something sacred. His hand emerged with a small, yellow envelope, aged, the seal already broken, corners soft. This, he said, his voice even lower now, I wasn't supposed to have. Steve looked up, alert but quiet. Downey turned the envelope in his fingers, staring at the name written across it. I found it 2 months after my son passed, buried in a box I hadn't touched in years. Between old notebooks, script pages, scraps of lyrics he used to write. He paused, eyes drifting, pulled back through time. I didn't open it for a week, he said. Not because I couldn't handle the pain. I was living in that already. I was afraid of what it might do to me. If it would break me further, or let me begin again. He opened the flap with a slowness that could have made time stop. I want to read you something, he said, breath catching. Just one part. He unfolded the letter, tracing a line with his thumb, like Braille, like he had to feel the words before he could speak them. Dad, if you're reading this, I'm guessing something didn't go the way either of us planned, but I need you to know. If you're still breathing, it means God's not done with you. You said that to me once. I didn't believe you then, but I do now. Steve's breath caught, his chest visibly stilled. I used to wonder if your pain would ever swallow you whole, but now I think maybe it's not meant to be destroyed, Maybe pain is how God whispers to people who've stopped listening. Maybe you're the one he chose to carry it. Downey looked up, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. I don't remember ever saying that to him, he whispered. But he did. He remembered. He paused, voice barely holding. The same words you once said in that video, I said to Sage without realizing it. And now they've come back to me. From him. Steve's hands were clenched now, not in tension, but in something deeper. Recognition, resonance. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. Downey gently placed the letter next to the first paper. 2 messages. One from a stranger who saved him. One from a son who still spoke. I think, he said, his voice breaking ever so slightly, some words weren't meant to be remembered. They were meant to return when you need them most. And in that moment, the studio held no applause, no camera cues, just silence and reverence, because everyone understood. They were sitting in the presence of something too holy for noise. The envelope now rested between them, 2 sheets of paper lying still, like sacred offerings, one born of faith, one of farewell. And yet the silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed, alive with everything that hadn't been said. Steve hadn't moved. His elbows still rested on his knees, his head bowed. His hands floated near the crucifix that had started all of this. For the first time in years, his voice, normally quick, confident, unshakable, felt like it didn't belong to him. I don't remember writing that, he said softly, eyes never leaving the folded paper. Downey didn't speak. He didn't need to. I said those words, Steve went on, but I never thought anyone would carry them. I wasn't trying to inspire anyone. I was trying not to drown. He took a breath. Not ordinary, one of those rare, heavy breaths that have to push through years of memory before reaching your lungs. It was Dallas, 1991, he said. Downey's eyes lifted, not surprised, just waiting. My daddy had just passed, Steve said, and I'd never known a silence like that. Not around me, in me, the kind where even screaming doesn't echo. He paused. The crucifix tilted, catching a slip of stage light. For weeks after the funeral, I went through the motions. Stand-up sets, radio shows, flashing cameras, laughs. But inside, I wasn't even there. The audience held still. Even the air seemed reluctant to shift. There was one night, Steve said, I was home, alone, sitting on the floor, lights off, just me, and a gun, on the table. Downey didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He listened, fully. I didn't want to die, Steve whispered. I just didn't want to hurt anymore. That sentence hung in the studio like smoke, quiet, shapeless, but inescapable. But something I still don't understand, told me to speak, just to talk, to anyone. He took another breath. I called a friend and said, if I don't get on a stage tomorrow, I'm not making it to the weekend. He booked me a mic slot. No jokes, just talk. Downey nodded, barely. I remember standing up there, hands shaking so bad I couldn't keep the mic still, sweat pouring down my back. And those words just came. If you're still breathing, it means God's not done with you. I didn't plan it, Steve said. I wasn't preaching. I was bleeding. He looked at the letter from Sage, then at Downey. And now you're sitting here telling me those words found their way back to you. Through your son, through a letter I was never meant to hear. He blinked and finally a tear broke free, slipping slow, like it had waited 3 decades for permission. I thought I was just some broken man trying to survive the night, Steve said. Turns out I was delivering a sermon that I needed to hear. Downey reached across the table. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. He laid his hand over Steve's, solid, warm, human. You weren't preaching, Downey said. You were surviving. That's what made it holy. And in that moment, grief became communion. 2 men broken in different places, realizing they had spoken the same prayer, just in different rooms. They sat in that silence. Not because there were no words, but because none were needed. The papers lay between them, and the crucifix, still glinting faintly against Steve's chest, seemed to glow under the weight of something real. Downey leaned back, not to retreat, but to release. You know what I've realized, he said, voice steady now, tempered like steel that's already known flame. We spend so much of our lives trying to outrun pain. We joke through it, smile past it, drown it out. He paused. No hurry. But when I lost Sage, I couldn't outrun it anymore. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying. Steve wiped the corner of his eye, still listening, still inside it. That's when I finally understood, Downey said. Pain isn't the punishment, it's the platform. Steve looked up slowly. Their eyes met. No host, no guest, just witness and witness. People think a pulpit's a stage, Downey said, or a church, a spotlight. But sometimes it's a hospital bed, a kitchen floor, a funeral, or the edge of your bed at midnight when you're asking God to explain something you can't make sense of. He paused. Let the truth breathe. Pain is the pulpit. Steve exhaled. His voice, though barely audible, was full. That's why your words reached me. Not because you had answers, but because you stood there in the middle of your own storm and said, I'm still here. Downey gave the faintest smile, the kind that doesn't reach the face, but glows warm behind the eyes. I used to think strength was never breaking, he said, that Tony Stark never cried, that Sherlock Holmes never faltered. He tapped the center of his chest. Real strength is staying when it hurts, showing up when no one sees, breathing when it would be easier not to. Steve let out a long breath, grounded, trembling at the edges. You said something earlier, Downey began again. Sometimes survival is the sermon. He nodded slowly. I didn't get it then, but I do now. He reached out and gently tapped the page where Steve's words were written. This wasn't written from a mountaintop. It came from the trench. That's why it cut so deep. Steve looked again at the letter from Sage, the handwriting shaky, uneven, but deliberate, like it had been written by someone who knew time was running out. I think Sage knew, Steve whispered, that pain isn't the opposite of purpose. It's where purpose begins. Downey nodded once, slowly. That's why it still speaks. That letter, it wasn't about saying goodbye. It was about passing something on. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It felt illuminated. 2 men, 2 battles, 1 truth. And somewhere between the words and the wounds, the studio was no longer a talk show. It had transformed into a sermon, one not delivered from a stage but from scars. The air didn't feel like broadcast anymore. It felt like sanctuary, not pews, not stained glass, but sacred nonetheless. Steve and Downey weren't alone. Not anymore. The stillness in the room shifted, not into applause or sound, but something deeper. A woman in the 3rd row stood up. She didn't raise a hand, didn't wait for permission. Her body moved before her mind had caught up. Middle-aged, wearing a pale blue blouse, hands clasped at her stomach like she was protecting something fragile. My son was 21, she said. Her voice shook, but it was steady. He overdosed last year. I haven't said that out loud in months, but tonight I had to. No response from the room, no reaction, just presence, breathing, witnessing. Then from the left aisle a man stood, older, 70s, worn lines across his face, a posture that told of wars no one else could see. I buried my wife, he said, 47 years. I haven't been able to cry since her funeral, but I did tonight. Steve didn't move. Downey didn't interrupt. Their role had shifted. They were no longer holding the fire. They had passed it. Then a teenage girl stood, hoodie sleeves stretched over her palms, knuckles tight. I tried to end my life last spring, she said, but someone sent me a clip of you, Steve. She blinked quickly. I didn't even know who I was watching, but I remember one line. If you're still breathing, I wrote it on my mirror, every day since. Steve's hand moved to his chest, not for show, not as reflex, but as anchoring. More people stood, a man with trembling lips, a woman holding a photo, a boy wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. They didn't stand to make statements. They stood because the silence between those 2 men had given them permission to be seen. Downey shifted slightly in his seat. watching them rise, like waves pushed by something ancient and invisible. No applause, no cue, just honesty catching flame. This, Downey whispered, more to himself than to Steve. This is what it means, when pain becomes purpose. Steve gave a single nod, words stuck behind something thicker than tears. Around them, the studio no longer felt like a set. It had become something sacred, not because of lights, not because of cameras, but because strangers had begun to confess, not to be rescued, but to breathe together. And in the unscripted rising of the wounded, one after another, they weren't just witnessing the story, they were becoming part of it. Somewhere off camera, a producer forgot to count time. In the control room, no one called for a cut. They all knew this moment was too holy to interrupt. People were still standing, some crying, some in quiet, some clutching things, pictures, hands, memories, all holding something heavy with a new kind of lightness. And in the center of it all, that small silver cross still shimmered gently on Steve's chest. Not because it was jewelry, not because it was symbolic, but because it had always been waiting for this. Downey sat back in his seat, gaze steady on the crucifix, not as an ornament, not even as belief, but as a thread, the start of it all. "I need to give you something," Downey said, standing slowly. Steve looked up, unsure. "I've worn this for over a decade," Downey continued. His hands reached to the back of his neck, unclasping a chain tucked beneath his shirt. The studio inhaled, not for the gesture, but for what it meant. It wasn't gold, it wasn't flashy, just a small, darkened crucifix, its edges worn smooth by time, skin, and grief. "I put this on the night we buried Sage," Downey said. "Not because I believed in anything at the time, but because I didn't know where else to place the weight." He held it in his open palm now, letting everyone see. "For years," Downey said, "I didn't take it off. Not on set, not in bed, not even in the shower." He wasn't boasting. He wasn't confessing. He was remembering. It wasn't faith back then. It was weight. Just a reminder I still felt something. Steve's eyes widened, not in shock, but in understanding. A quiet click between lives that had run parallel in pain. "I carried this cross," Downey continued, stepping forward, "not because I was strong, but because I wasn't. It was my lifeline, my protest, my proof that even broken things can be held." He extended the chain towards Steve. His hand trembled just enough to tell the truth. "But it's not mine anymore." Steve stared, frozen. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. Downey's voice dropped into something softer. "You gave me the words that kept me breathing. You lit a match I didn't even know I was holding. And now, I want to give this back." He paused. "Not because I'm healed, but because healing doesn't begin until we stop holding everything alone." Steve's hand hovered in the air, uncertain. This wasn't a gift. It was a surrender. And he knew that. When his fingers finally closed around the chain, it felt like catching a falling ember. Hot, holy, heavy. He looked down at it, then up at Downey. "You carried this for me," he whispered. Downey nodded. "And now you carry it, for whoever comes next." Behind them, the audience remained standing, but the silence had shifted. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was light, sacred. Two crosses, two men, one passed from fire, one passed from faith. In that simple act, quiet, unrehearsed, irreversible, a circle closed. One that had begun years ago, with a whisper in the dark. There was no music, no applause, just breathe. Because in that moment, everyone understood. Some burdens aren't meant to be put down. They're meant to be passed on, hand to trembling hand. Steve sat, the cross resting in his palm, the weight unfamiliar, but somehow right. He didn't put it on. Not yet. He just held it, thumb brushing over the worn ridges like trying to feel the years it had survived. The cameras didn't zoom in. No producers whispered a cue. The moment didn't shrink. It expanded. Quiet, reverent. Downey remained standing, not looming, just present. Then his voice dropped into something only grief and grace know how to form. You thought you were just telling jokes, he said, locking eyes with Steve. You thought you were just buying time to survive one more night on stage. He stepped closer. But what you were really doing was lighting fires in people you didn't even know existed. Steve looked up. His eyes were wet, but his voice returned, slow, scraped, sacred. I didn't think anyone was listening. You weren't supposed to, Downey replied. That's what makes it real. He gestured softly to the audience, to the woman who lost her son, to the old veteran, to the girl with the mirror. And now dozens more, faces streaked with tears but finally clear. You didn't just speak, Downey said. You carried something, something heavy, and you didn't know it, but every word you dropped behind you lit the way for someone else. Steve looked back at the cross. His hand closed around it with something like surrender, something like peace. You carried light, Downey said, even when you were drowning. Steve let out a soft, shaky laugh. I didn't feel like light. Maybe you weren't, Downey said. Maybe you were just the match. And that line hit harder than any applause ever could. No one clapped. They just breathed. A quiet inhale shared across the studio, like someone had just opened a window in a house they didn't know was locked. Steve stood slowly, the cross still in his hand. He looked at the people, not as an entertainer, but as a man seeing others the way he'd always hoped someone would see him. I don't know what to say, he admitted, voice trembling. Downey stepped up beside him, not to speak for him, just to be there. You don't have to say anything, he said. You already did. And then, without a prompt, without a script, Steve Harvey bowed his head, not for show, not for camera, but for something bigger. I think we should pray, he said, not as a command, as an offering. People began to follow. Some bowed their heads. Some touched their hearts. Some simply stood still, eyes wide open, letting themselves be seen. No outro played, no credits rolled, just stillness. And for one long, luminous breath, that studio wasn't a studio anymore. It was sanctuary, not because everyone believed the same thing, but because, for the first time, they believed in each other. And somewhere in that invisible space between pain and purpose, a whisper echoed, if you're still breathing, it means God's not done with you. Not a closing line, a beginning. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.